I haven't had sex in months, the Giant Apache Girl tells shy rancher, best Wild West stories. The desert sun set high and merciless over the cracked earth of Red Hollow Ranch, painting the world in shades of dust and fire. When Eli Carter felt the smallest end of his quiet life reach out and twist his fate forever, though he did not yet know it, he had lived his 26 years in silence, spoken more to horses than to people, hiding behind fences, behind work, behind the constant weight of being invisible in a land that celebrated loud men and hard fists. And it was on a day like this, with sweat on his neck and dust on his boots, that he saw her for the first time. She did not walk into the ranch. She seemed to rise from the heat itself, tall as legend, broad in frame, yet moving with a calm grace that bent the world around her. Braids dark against sunburnt skin, eyes steady as mountains, and the men working the yard went silent without knowing why, as though something older than fear had pressed a hand to their throats. Eli felt it too, a pressure in his chest. Not fear, but a knowing that his small, hidden life had just collided with something untamable. And when she stopped before him, shadow falling over his boots, he couldn't even lift his eyes at first, staring instead at the way dust curled around her steps as if unsure whether it was allowed to touch her. Her voice when it came was low and steady, asking for water as if she were asking for nothing at all. And when he lifted the canteen with trembling hands, their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, a touch that sent heat up his arm sharper than the sun. And in that moment he realized how long it had been since another human had touched him. Without cruelty or command, she studied him in silence, while he stared anywhere but her face. And then, with a faint tilt of her head that was neither cruel nor amused, she said quietly that it had been months since she had felt the warmth of a man's presence beside her, not as a threat, not as a tease, but as a plain truth spoken into the dust between them. And the world seemed to pause around that sentence as Eli finally dared to look up and found no mockery in her eyes, only a deep, tired honesty that mirrored the loneliness he had carried like a second skin. The ranch hands eventually stirred, whispers following her like nervous birds as she drank and returned the canteen. But Eli remained frozen, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen in a way he never had before. And when she asked his name, his voice nearly disappeared in his throat as he gave it, each sound fragile, each breath unpracticed in being heard. And she told him hers, a name shaped by wind and river and blood. And though he would later struggle to remember every syllable clearly, he would never forget the way it felt to be spoken to as if he were real. She did not leave the ranch that day, finding work easily among men too stunned to refuse her strength. And over the following hours, Eli watched from the edges as she lifted what 3 men struggled to move, broke horses that had thrown every rider, and stood unshaken beneath stares that ranged from desire to fear. Yet she never once postured for them, never sought their approval. And when evening came and the heat softened into gold, she found Eli again by the fence where he always retreated when the world grew too loud, standing close enough that he could smell dust and leather and something faintly sweet beneath it. And she asked why someone so gentle had chosen such a violent place to live. He answered in the only way he knew, with truth, saying that quiet men did not choose much of anything. They simply endured until endurance became life. And she considered that in silence before telling him that endurance without touch turned the heart to stone, not in bitterness, but in longing that never healed. The words unsettled him, not because they were forward, but because they named something he had never dared admit even to himself. And as stars began to shape themselves overhead, she reached for his hand again, slower this time, giving him space to pull away. But he did not, and when their hands joined more fully, he understood for the first time that strength was not always loud, nor was courage always visible. And that night, the desert winds carried a different kind of tension across Red Hollow, one not born of guns or grudges, but of 2 lonely souls, standing on opposite ends of the same ache, neither yet knowing how deeply the other would change them. Morning returned with the same merciless sun, but a different weight in Eli's chest. Heavier now, not with dread, but with anticipation he could not explain. And when he found her already awake in the yard, muscles moving in slow, deliberate patterns as she fixed a broken gate alone, he felt again that quiet pull toward her. The way the world seemed to rearrange itself when she entered it, and though his first instinct was once more to retreat, something steadier than fear pushed him forward this time, words stumbling from his mouth as he offered help that she did not truly need but accepted all the same. They worked side by side without many words, yet the silence between them was no longer empty, but charged with shared presence. Each glance carrying a question neither dared speak, and when the gate finally stood again, solid and unmoving, she leaned on the post and told him stories of roads that had no names, of battles fought more within than without, of being admired for strength, yet rarely chosen for gentleness. And as she spoke, Eli realized that the loneliness he had assumed belonged only to small. Men like himself wore many shapes, even towering ones. He admitted in return how his shyness had made a cage of his own life, how months had turned into years without touch simply because he did not believe he was meant for it. And she listened without judgment, without pity, only with a deep attention that made him feel suddenly more solid in his own skin. And when she said again, softer now, that it had been months since she had been held as a woman rather than a weapon, the words were no longer striking, but vulnerable, and something in him shifted from trembling to resolve. The ranch did not grow quieter around them, but louder with rumor and unease. Men who feared her power, resenting the ease with which she spoke to someone they overlooked entirely. And when that resentment finally took form in careless cruelty one afternoon, it was not her towering presence that diffused it, but Eli's voice, shaking yet unyielding, as he stepped between danger and the only person who had ever truly looked at him. And though his words were simple, they landed with a force he himself did not understand, forcing those who mocked to see a strength they could not measure. Later, as dusk bled into the desert, she found him alone again by the fence, hands still trembling not with fear, but with the delayed echo of courage. And without a word, she placed her palm over his heart, steady and warm, letting him feel the rhythm beneath his ribs as clearly as she felt it beneath her hand. She did not promise him a future carved in safety, nor did he offer her a life free of struggle. But they shared something rarer than vows, a recognition of one another's hunger, not for bodies alone, but for belonging, for being chosen not despite who they were, but because of it. And as the desert cooled and stars once again took their places above Red Hollow, the ranch changed in subtle ways as he walked a little taller, and she laughed a little more freely. And the space between giant and shy man became not a distance, but a bridge, built from small shared silences and steady courage rather than grand gestures. And though hardship did not disappear from their world, it no longer stood unchallenged. For loneliness, once named and shared, lost much of its power to wound in secret, long after others would tell wild versions of their story filled with exaggeration and spectacle. The truth remained quieter yet far more powerful, that two souls who had gone too long without being held found each other not through conquest, not through dominance, but through honesty brave enough to be tender. And in that truth lay a reminder that even the most unlikely connections carry the strength to reshape a life when they are met without fear. The change between them was no longer invisible after that night of understanding, and yet neither dared to name it aloud, as if speaking it too soon might fracture what had only just begun to heal. But the ranch felt different under Eli's boots as he walked each morning, steadier somehow, as though the earth itself had grown more certain beneath his steps. And she moved through the yard, not as an untouchable figure anymore, but as someone who sometimes searched for him, without realizing she was doing it, their eyes meeting across distance with quiet recognition that startled them both every time. The men who once whispered now watched more closely, some with curiosity, some with resentment, but neither of them belonged to those gazes anymore. bound instead by the fragile thread of trust they were weaving slowly between their separate worlds. And when the first real storm rolled across the land in months, tearing the sky open with dust and lightning, it found them caught together near the outer stables, struggling to bring frightened horses back. Inside, as thunder cracked close, enough to shake the bones, and in the chaos, a beam came loose, crashing down where Eli had stood moments earlier, missing him only because her hand had surged out to pull him, back with a force driven by pure instinct, his body slamming against hers as the wood shattered beside them, dust blinding, noise swallowing the world. And in that instant, pressed against her chest with her arms holding him fast, his fear broke fully open, not in panic but in release, breath hitching as he realized how close he had come to vanishing without ever having truly lived. She did not let go when the danger passed, not immediately, her grip firm around him as though anchoring him to the earth itself. And when at last he looked up, shaken and unsteady, he saw in her eyes not the warrior the world admired, but a woman who had nearly lost something she had not known she was already protecting. And the truth of that realization crossed between them without words, shifting everything that still remained unspoken. Later, when the storm had passed and the air lay heavy and clean, they sat beneath the ruined shelter sharing breath and silence, Eli's hands still trembling as he admitted how terrified he had been, not of dying, but of dying without ever having touched the life he was only just beginning to believe he deserved. And she listened with a stillness deeper than before, lowering her forehead gently to his as though closing the space that fear had carved between his heart and the world, her voice almost a whisper. When she finally said that for someone who believed himself small, he carried a courage that had already changed the course of 2 lives, and something inside him shifted then for good, no longer seeing her only as the impossible figure who had awakened him, but as someone who too had nearly lost the fragile hope she had found in him. From that day on, their connection no longer hovered on the edge of uncertainty, but moved carefully forward, not with urgency, not with reckless fire, but with the quiet certainty that neither of them was walking alone anymore. And though the world beyond the ranch still waited with its dangers, judgments, and unforgiving roads, Eli no longer faced it as a man who merely endured, and she no longer carried her strength as a shield meant only to keep others out. For somewhere between storm and survival, between fear and protection, 2 lonely paths had fused into one direction, neither of them yet fully understood. But both were ready to follow,